Welcome to the Futures Lab. So, this week we're going to start making the projectiles that our character needs to avoid. And as tribute to Sans, one of the most favourite and beloved Undertale characters, I'm going to make my projectile a bone. So, bottom right corner, just here, hover up until you have the paint option selected. Click on that, and we're going to paint our projectile. So I'm going to choose a box tool. I'm going to make the fill as white. And I'm going to make this fairly small. Now, your projectile can be anything that you want it to be, but bearing in mind that the direction your projectile faces is going to be pointing towards the right. So when your projectile is moving, like this bone here, it's going to be always going in this direction. So if you want like fireballs or arrows or whatever, just make sure that it's pointing towards the right. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to select all of this and make sure it's centered. Use the select tool, grab everything, move it around, and then make sure that little cross goes in the center there. Okay, let's rename this as projectile. Now, we're going to actually have multiple costumes with different types of projectiles and different types of attacks. So I'm just going to refer to this as bone. Let's just rename the costume up there. And then let's go back to the code. So what we're going to do is we're going to make clones of this sprite. We're going to make multiple clones of it. So we need to give our clones some instructions. So let's go to control the orange category. And let's look for when I start as clone. Drag that out. Now we're going to hide our original projectile, which means that when we make our clones, we need it to show itself. So let's go to the looks category, dark purple, and drag out show. And then let's go to control and get out a repeat until. Now we're going to repeat until touching edge. So let's go to sensing. Let's get out a touching mouse pointer. Put that next to the until and select edge. So repeat until touching edge. This means that when we start our projectiles, no matter what direction that they're going in, once they reach the edge of the screen, they are going to delete themselves. So we're going to go to control, look near the bottom for delete this clone, and drag that out. Let's get out move 10 steps. Let's do a bit of a test to make sure that this works. Let's go to control and let's get out a create clone of myself. Just put it off somewhere by itself. Then go to events and pull out when space key pressed. So now when you hit spacebar, it makes a clone. We need to make sure that the bones are underneath the box sprite. Let's get out a when green flag clicked. Drag that out into with some space underneath. Let's go to looks and look for a go to front layer. Drag that out, but then click on where it says front and change it to back. So now when we hit go, it always goes behind the box. And this allows us to make these clones that look like they are only within the box. So that's pretty cool. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make some variables to control how fast our projectiles move and also how often they are created, how often they are cloned. So we're going to go to variables, the orange category over here, and we're going to make a variable just here. We're going to call this projectile speed. And then press OK, and it needs to be for all sprites. Then let's get out a set my variable, change that to projectile speed, and set the projectile speed to, let's say 6, which is very slightly faster than the player. Then we're going to make another variable, and we're going to call this one projectile spawn rate. When you spawn something in a video game, you make a clone of it, you make a copy of it, and we are going to be spawning lots of projectiles. You're creating these projectiles, and the rate at which we do them is how fast we do them, how much we are waiting in between creating them. So let's get out a set my variable, change that to projectile spawn rate, and let's say 0.4 seconds. That's how fast we're going to be making new projectiles. Okay, that all seems pretty good. Also, to make sure that our original bone is hidden so that it can't be seen, this original clone here, what we're going to do is we are going to go to looks, the purple category, and we're going to get out a hide and put that here as well to make sure that our original projectile can't be seen. So now we're going to make a function, or myBlock, that's going to create our projectiles for us. So for now, we can take this when space key pressed, create clone of myself, and throw it away, because we don't need it anymore. Let's go to myBlocks and click on make a block. Now, we're going to make all of our different types of attacks, different types of projectiles have a name. And I'm going to call this one scatter, because it's going to be a bit random. And I'm going to type it in capital letters, and the reason that I'm doing that will become more obvious later. So once you've typed in scatter with capital letters, press OK, and move this define scatter over here, and let's go to control and get out a forever loop, and let's put it underneath the hide. That's underneath the when green flag clicked. Okay, and then let's go back to my blocks and pull out a scatter block. So forever scatter. So scatter doesn't do anything yet because we haven't put anything underneath define scatter. So let's fix that. So let's start off with making projectiles spawn at random points above the box and travel downwards. So we're going to go to motion, the dark blue category, and we're going to look for go to X and Y. Drag that out. Now remember, the Y variable controls how far up or down a sprite is on the screen, and the X variable controls the left and right. Let's sort out the Y variable first. This is actually the easy part. We want the projectiles always to be above the box. So what's a number that will make sure that they are always above the box? Well, if we just drag the heart somewhere where we want the projectiles to be, then we can actually look at the Y variable of the heart. Can you see that's 51? Yeah, that seems about right. Let's go back to the projectile and let's set the Y as 50. Let's make it a round number. Okay, so that will make sure that the projectiles are above the box. Now this is the thing which is interesting. We need to make sure that the projectiles are on a random point somewhere from left to right. So let's again grab our heart. Now I'm going to make the bones appear slightly off from the side of the box. So there we've got minus 119 on the left side, and because our box is centered, about the same point should be roughly 100 and about the same on the right side. That seems about right. So again, let's round that up to, let's go back to the projectile, and now we need to get a random number generator. Let's go to the green category operators and get out a pick random 1 to 10. Put that into our x. We want the lowest number to be minus 120. Again, we'll round it up. And we'll make the highest number 120. So this should pick a random point between this left side of the screen and this right side of the screen. So let's put a direction that our projectile should be. Let's go to motion and get out point in direction and click on this 90. Now you can put a number in and that number will tell the sprite to point in a certain direction, or you can drag this hand little arrow and make sure it's pointing down. Remember, we're spawning these on the top of the box, so they need to come down. Let's go to control and let's get out a create clone of myself. Okay, let's hit go. Okay, that's really good. We can even have a look at what that looks like without the box. That's perfect. You can see what a big difference it makes to have the box on top of all the sprites. Obviously that's too many and they are too difficult to avoid, but that's good. So next thing, let's put in a weight. So in your projectile sprite, underneath define scatter, get out a weight 1 seconds. Let's try that. Now that's okay, but it's happening a little bit too rarely. Let's speed that up a little bit. And we have made our variables. So let's go to the variables category on the left, pull out projectile spawn rate and put that over the 1. Also, something that we haven't done yet is if you look for when I start as clone, remember we made our move 10 steps? Let's replace that with projectile speed. Last week we talked about why it's good to use variables, and this is a good example. We can change the speed of our projectiles depending on whether the game is getting harder or easier. Makes a big difference. So now what we should have is we've got a nice randomly generated selection of projectiles, but they are only coming from one direction. So let's fix that. What we are going to do is we are going to build an input into our MyBlock, an input into our function. So go to define scatter and right click on it and then click edit. So this is what we saw when we were making the MyBlock. We are going to put a space after scatter and then type in direction, this time not in capitals. So now we should have scatter in capitals and direction not in capitals. Then what I want you to do is click on add an input number or text, this one here. And for now we're just going to call this capital D. Now press OK. So now what we have is we have an input that we can put into our scatter direction, just like we have with when we say move 10 steps or pick random number or point in direction. We have an input. So you can put something into this input and it will change how the code runs in defined scatter direction. So what we need to do is we need to create an if statement. We need to go to control and get out an if. Now put this right underneath scatter direction. But then I want you to grab our create clone and pull that outside of the if statement. Then we're going to go to operators and pull out an equals operator and put that in between the if and the then. Now, can you see where we've got this D? We're going to drag this D and put it just in that first section of the equals operator. Then click on the 50, and we're going to start, and we're going to call this, for now we're going to call this top. So if D, and D stands for direction, equals top, then we're going to go to pick random this and this and point in this direction, and then create clones of myself. So now, if we go back to our forever loop and type in top, all in capital letters, scatter direction top, it should do the same thing it did before. Now here's where things get interesting. What we're going to do is we're going to make some space. We're going to grab the create clone of myself, right click on the if statement, duplicate it, and put it underneath. But this time we're going to say if D equals bottom. So that's going to create projectiles in the bottom of the screen. So now what we're going to do is we're going to click on this point in direction, point the projectiles going up, and we also need to change this Y coordinate right here. Let's drag the heart down and see. Minus 150 should be okay. Yeah, let's try minus 150. Now at this point, you might notice that I've redrawn my box sprite to make it a little bit smaller, so there's a bit more space underneath it. You might want to do that yourself if you made a box sprite that was that the box was a little too large. Okay, let's make sure, so we've got we know what Y coordinate we need, minus 150. So now what we can do is if we go back to our forever loop, and then we go to my blocks, we can pull out scatter direction. But if we type in this time bottom, now what will happen, let's see what happens. We've now got first a projectile being spawned from the top of the box and then from the bottom of the box. That's really good. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So now what we need to do is we need to do it for the left and right. And at this point, if you want, you can decide to change what your inputs can be. I've been just typing in the direction I want to spawn the projectiles from, all in capitals. But if you wanted, you could have T and B like this, as long as you understand that this input that you're using here needs to be identical to what you have in your if statements. Now, if you don't understand that, don't worry. Just keep it all as capital letters, full words, so that, and follow along with me, and then that way our code will be the same. So let's go back to our define scatter attack. Let's make some more space underneath here. Let's duplicate and pop this here. So now we've got if D equals, let's say, left. Now, here's where we need to change the coordinates that we're giving the projectile. So before, we set it to have always the same Y variable, which is how far up or down it is, and we picked a random X variable, so it would be randomly left and right. Now we need to do the reverse of that. We need to take this pick random and move it into the Y variable because we're doing the left side. And what we're going to actually do is we already have some good numbers that we already know about. So let's try typing in Y is pick random. Let's say the lowest is minus 150 and the highest is 50, because those were the Y's that we used in our previous code. And let's try x being minus 120. So if our D for direction is left, then go to x minus 120, y pick random 150 to 50. And let's go back to our forever loop underneath our when green flag clicked and put in a new scatter direction and type in left. So let's see if the left code is working. We have a problem. It's not working because we didn't update the point in direction. So inside our if D equals left, we need to change the direction so that it's pointing right. Now let's test it out. There we go. Now, what we can do as well is you can adjust these numbers to make them a bit tighter. Can you see that sometimes one of the projectiles is just a little bit too low? I'm going to change this minus 150, let's say minus 130 in our D equals left. Or even minus 140 might be fine. Oh no, I think I'm happy with that. That looks good. So now it's to get our last direction working. All we need to do is make some more space here, duplicate this, connect it all up. We're going to rename this as right, and nice and simple, all we need to do is change the minus 120 in our x variable to 120. We need to change our point in direction from right to left. So now what we have here is this whole my block, this whole function. You are able, every time you want to summon a projectile, you are able to very simply pull out scatter direction, type in what direction you want the projectile to come from, and then it will create it. Now, there's one more thing we're going to do. We're actually going to add in another input to our scatter attack. So right click on scatter direction, we're going to edit. Now first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in a new label. Click here, we're going to call this label repeat. And then we're going to click on add an input, and we're going to call this R. R is for repeat. Then press OK. So now we have two inputs. We can decide how many times we want to repeat our scatter attack. But first we need to go to Control, get out a repeat 10, and put that right underneath where we've got define scatter direction repeat. And then drag this R and put it over the 10. Now this is a lot of code, but now we don't need to worry about this code anymore, because all of this code has been packaged up into one of these lines. So if we put a number next to repeat, let's say repeat 5, and then repeat 4, and then repeat 7, and then repeat 2, what you'll notice is now a single line can create a certain number of projectiles, and you can decide which direction they're coming from, how many of the projectiles that will happen in a row. And this is how you will build up particular strings of attacks much more easily than having to use all of this. And if this is something that you don't understand, don't worry too much. We'll cover how to make different types of attacks in the future. But if this is something that you kind of are following along with me, and you've done this kind of thing before, have a think about what other types of inputs you could put through this MyBlock. You could have, for example, different speeds where you change the speed of the projectile built into the inputs of our MyBlocks. So being able to put an input into a MyBlock or function is really, really useful. Okay, so one last piece of advice. If you're worried something is going wrong with your projectiles, here's a good thing to check. Go to your box sprite and then click the hide button just there. Then if we hit the green flag, we'll be able to see where our sprites are spawning and what direction they're going in. So if they're going in the right direction, they're going in the correct direction that we want them to be going in, then something else that might be going wrong is that the sprites might be spawning too close to the edge of the screen. The projectiles might be touching the screen when they are created, which means they delete themselves the moment they touch the screen. So to see if this is happening, what we need to do is we need to go to the projectile sprite, look for the code when I start as clone, and right before delete this clone, let's put in a wait. I'm just going to make this wait as 0.2 seconds. That should be long enough for us to see if sprites are deleting themselves as soon as they're created. And then you can watch the sprites and check to see, especially with the ones that are going left and right, if they are spawning too low on the screen, or your sprites are very large, so they are touching the edge of the screen when they are spawned, then they'll be deleting themselves straight away. This is what it's going to look like. It'll look a little bit like, I'm just going to forcibly make these projectiles spawn too low on the screen, so don't make these changes to your game. But this is what it would look like. When the sprites are going left and right, they'll just appear and disappear because of that wait. We can see them because we put in that wait 0.2 seconds. So if that's something that you're worried about, you'll be able to check using this method. Otherwise, if everything seems to be going well, don't worry about it. I'm going to put these numbers back the way they were. So I believe it was 50... and minus 130, and everything should be going well, especially once the box is back. So have an experiment with changing some of these numbers, and if you think that the lower numbers are too low, then just reduce this. So if it's minus 130, try changing it to minus 120, and that will bring up the bottom possible place that the projectiles are spawning up a little bit. So that's everything. Make sure that you subscribe to see the next episode. Stay awesome, be cool to each other, and take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time, ninjas.